Okay, so in our last episode, we talked about beer in the Middle Ages leading up to Elizabethan England.
Yes, and Shakespeare's dad being the official beer taster.
And how ale was really more popular in the British Isles. Ale was sweeter, it was darker. In order to be beer, they added hops, which made it taste bitter, and while that was really popular in Germany, it just wasn't catching on in England. At least it didn't for a couple hundred years. Where it really caught on was in Germany. The Munich Beer Festival started in 1810, and it is the largest public festival in the world. Nowadays, there are 6 million visitors, 5 million liters of beer are consumed, and 200,000 pairs of sausages get eaten every year. It started in 1810 as a way to celebrate a royal marriage, and gradually they started drinking more and more beer. The thing that's really interesting about Munich is it's where what is now the most popular style of beer was developed. It's called lager. It was developed by the local monks who started storing their beer in caves that were very, very cold. And because the ice was there, they developed a new form of yeast, which created lager. Because the yeast is what determines what the taste of the beer is. That's why every area has its own kind of flavor to it. And this is going to come full circle. Yeast is very, very important and eventually becomes a huge competitive advantage. Now, lager, Emily, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my sources said that lager actually comes from the German word that means stored.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Emily speaks German, for those who don't know. She lived in Austria for a semester.
I did.
So beer is getting more and more popular. This festival is growing. And about 30 years later, in 1840, Gabriel Sedlmayr was a German brewer near Munich who takes this lager style and he decides to modernize it. He starts using a thermometer so that he can actually test the temperature and start making that consistent. He uses new devices that let you test the amount of sugar in the beer and in the mash. And he starts using a steam engine, which allows him to move heavy materials around the brewery.
And this is all part of a greater picture, because what you have is people starting to look at things what we now call the scientific method. They have the instruments, and they're using them to get data, and then they're able to make observations, which they then can use to make conclusions.
Well, and the fun thing about Sedlmayr using this data to make his own conclusions about his process is he figured out that if he could do it with his process, he could do it with everyone else's too. So he and his business partner decided they wanted to go visit the other breweries in Europe. Their goal was, their theory was that the yeast in different areas was what matters. And if you could understand the yeast, then you could understand your competitors and make better and better beer. So to do this, they took their canes and they hollowed them out and they drilled little holes into their canes. And they had a whole bunch of these and they took a different one with them to each brewery they visited. And as they were visiting, they would be talking to their guide or the owner, usually pretending that they were going to make a large order. And they would wave the cane over the vat where the beer was bubbling and fermenting. And some of that yeast would get caught into this hollowed out cane, which they would then wrap up very carefully and take back to their brewery near Munich.
Corporate espionage.
It was exactly. They started practicing industrial corporate espionage. And because of this, they could take the yeast and they could experiment with different batches. And so they were applying their new modern equipment and the scientific process and good old-fashioned espionage and theft to brewing. And the more they did this, the more they were able to create these very unique kinds of beer. And this style of lager became very, very pronounced. Now, a couple years later, Joseph Grohl took Sedlmayr's style of lager and he ran with it. He was at that time, beer was very, very dark. Lager initially is not what we see nowadays. It was this very, very dark, kind of sweet but bitter brew. Grohl came along and he wanted to use pale malt, which was ridiculous to most people, but it suddenly produced this beautiful caramel golden colored beer that we now call the Pilsner style because it was near a town called Pilsen near Munich. So it became this. It was beautiful. It was sparkling, and it was pale and pretty, and people had tried this before, but it never quite caught on. There's a very unique reason why Pilsner suddenly became very, very popular, and it has everything to do with drinkware. About the mid-1800s, glass drinkware became more popular, and suddenly the sophisticated people didn't want to drink their beer out of tankards and metal cups. They wanted to drink it in a beautiful glass. And if it's in a glass, you can see what's in it. So all those dark, cloudy, not necessarily pure-looking beers suddenly weren't as appealing to drink. But this beautiful, golden, clear beer with a little bit of a head on it suddenly became wildly popular. And that actually, now it's Pilsner. It's a golden lager, and 90% of all beer produced now is that kind of golden lager. Now, at the same time, on the other side of Europe, in Ireland, a whole different kind of beer was being developed. Beer there was a lot darker. We all know Guinness, right? It's the most famous Irish beer. It's a very, very dark color. It's actually a kind of dry stout. And that name stout comes from a longer name called extra stout porter. Now, porter is named after the people who drank it. So it actually began in London, where their kind of courier, which is what a porter is. A porter was a courier in the 1800s. They would be running around town, doing hard work in the heat, and they'd want to stop for a drink. So it'd be a little bench by the pub wherever they were stopping. They'd drop their bag, they'd go inside, and they would get this dark, dry stout. And they started calling it the porter. Now, it wasn't as popular in London. It was Guinness who really, really jumped on it. So this fella Guinness decided to take over an abandoned brewery near an abbey in Dublin. It was 1759, and he got a lease for £54 per annum, and that lease was meant to last 9,000 years.
Only 9,000?
At the time,
long-term thinking.
It is, right? The economy was pretty depressed. And he was just going to start out and do the best he could. Now, for context, now 10 million glasses of Guinness are poured every single day.
On that 9,000 years, it's because, generally speaking, contracts cannot be indefinite.
You have to have some period.
Eternal. Basically, they have to have some period to them. And so 9,000 years is basically saying, hey, it's yours.
Yep. So Guinness is developing stout at the time. And suddenly it's becoming ridiculously popular. People never expected it to be, because during this time period, the Irish were moving more and more towards these becoming more popular, lighter and lighter beers over the next 100 years. But he stuck with stout, that darker beer. And it became so popular, they were using so much water that at one point the local, they called it the corporation, but the local utility company threatened to turn off his water because he was using too much. And the story, which has some historical backing, is that he ended up showing up at their offices with a pickaxe and physically threatening them if they tried to cut off his water. So, woohoo, early mafia.
Hey, that is not unknown. Kodak, of Eastman Kodak fame, actually destroyed one of his competitors by buying his water supply and turning it off.
Yep. Water was power. And if you didn't have water, you couldn't live, you couldn't brew, you couldn't bake. Water was the crux of the Industrial Revolution. You couldn't use steam without it. So he was able to keep going and going and going. The Irish brewers really ended up taking over everything. By 1899, the Guinness Company was only doing dark stout, nothing else. While everyone else was moving towards the lighter beers, and they ended up going out of business. It got to the point that in 1920, 1 in 10 men in Dublin was dependent on Guinness directly or indirectly for their wages.
1 in 10?
1 in 10 in Dublin.
That's significant.
That's how huge it got. And it still is an incredibly large force. So you have these two different groups that were building and developing. And in the middle of all of it in Great Britain, we talk about arms races and people being in competition. Well, we've covered this in another podcast. They got into vat competitions. Every brewer in the UK wanted bigger and bigger vats. That's how they were going to compete with the rest of the organizations. And
making more beer in a shorter period of time.
And being able to show off, because this is the Industrial Revolution. People wanted to show that they were more modern. They could do more. So it reached the point that when the Muse Brewery opened in London, it was so big that over 200 people dined in white coats and ties and everything in their vat. 200 people could fit for a dinner inside their vat before it was filled. Which seemed, it's like the Titanic. What an amazing marvel of modern engineering.
Right.
Until their vat exploded.
Oops.
And thousands of gallons of beer rushed out into the local neighborhood, which was not a particularly wealthy neighborhood, and a lot of people died. It flooded entire homes, women, children, men, everywhere. There was no way to escape. It was like a dam had broken, and these thousands of gallons rushed out into the local neighborhood. And then, in true yellow journalism style, people, there wasn't anywhere else to go, so people would fish out the bodies and they would take them up to the second floor to get them out. But people wanted to come and see the spectacle. So people crowded into the area as things started to drain, and they would all want to go up to these second floors and see the bodies that were drowned by beer, which was, again, a really stupid move because they had been so damaged by water and beer that the floors broke. and people fell down from the second story and drowned in the beer again. It's one of the largest industrial accidents of the 1800s. And it's a lesson about what happened. I mean, all these years of competition from the monks who were brewing different beer and styles and competing with each other through these larger industrializations all the way up to this kind of climax of going too far.
And you have that problem there because people didn't understand metallurgy very well. And I don't know if the exact cause was ever determined, but it's like in the early 1900s, you had the Molasses Flood in Boston. And what basically happened is on a cold winter's day, you had these huge tanks of molasses that underwent brittle fracture. Metal gets very brittle when it gets cold, and the stress of the molasses in the tank caused the tank to fracture. And all of a sudden, you had all this molasses flowing down the street, and if you got caught in it, you were stuck.
Yep.
And the same thing happened with the vats. Very likely, because the fermentation builds up pressure, if you can't release it.
And that's what happened. You had one huge vat. It had about 130,000 imperial gallons of beer, and it ruptured. And the pressure of it going caused a domino effect. So all these other vats just exploded and exploded. And I think it was more than 300,000 imperial gallons were leached out and just gushed into the street, which was surrounded by tenements and low-income housing. And it destroyed, let me see if I have the notes here, 2 homes and crumbled the wall of the Tavistock Arms pub and trapped these people there. And it... Let me make sure I've got this right. In fact, the brewer was finally taken to court over the accident, but it was ruled to be an act of God by the judge and jury, so no one was considered responsible. The company couldn't cope with the financial implications of the disaster because they had the loss of sale, but they'd already paid the duty on the beer. So they'd already put that expenditure out, and they didn't have the beer to pay for it. And they were able to apply to Parliament to reclaim the duty, and they were able to keep going until the brewery was eventually demolished. And the funny thing is, at the time, this was considered a great triumph for industrialization, because even though this horrible thing had happened, they'd survived, but the local neighborhood never recovered, and that's not what's being accounted for in the story of industrialization, was the very real human cost.
And that happened over and over again. A lot of societal costs were never considered. In fact, even today, they're not considered.
If you'd like to learn more about the subject that we discussed today, you can find multimedia content, links to articles we discussed, and videos on our website at www.hiddenhistoryofbusiness.com. You can also find us on Facebook as The Hidden History of Business and on Twitter as well. Thanks for listening.